So Keith Perry is the owner and lead drone operator at Hudson Valley Drones. While operating in the UAV space for nearly half a decade, he's built and maintained a successful drone services company in upstate New York. Prior to his immersion in the UAV market, he also pursued and operated successful ventures in HVAC and insurance. In addition to holding a bachelor's in criminal justice, he is a Part 107 and a certified holder, and also is a certified level 1 SUAS thermographer through FLIR's ITC program. He has extensive experience operating the Inspire 2 and Matrice 210 platforms with both RGB and thermal sensors, and is proficient in precision mapping using ground control points and data processing and drone deployment Pix4D. Keith also helps all of our customers at Scalify with hardware selection, and really is a fantastic resource when it comes to understanding both what hardware to buy and how to best leverage that hardware. So we're gonna have Keith kind of take us through a bunch of the different components as it relates to hardware and your camera settings to do the best that you can with managing exposure and lighting. So Keith, over to you.
Great, thank you, Jason, and thank you for the introduction. For those of you who attended our first webinar, welcome back. For those of you who didn't, it's nice to see you. John did a fantastic job in the last section explaining why we need good photography and illustrating why we need good photography in order to create a good model. And just to reiterate, good photography equals good photogrammetry. John said this too, and this is something that I like to keep in mind, that I encourage people to keep in mind when they're using their drone to collect imagery. All your drone is a fancy camera that's strapped to a flying tripod, a flying robot. So while it's important to be a good drone operator and not crash your drone and be able to navigate that space, it's also important to at least have a high level of understanding of how a camera works so that you can make sure your imagery is good. And if it's not good, you can make the adjustments in order to correct the photography and make it a usable product. So there's always a debate amongst photographers on whether you should use auto settings or your manual settings in your drone when you're flying photogrammetry missions. We always recommend that you start off by flying on auto settings that probably works 50 to 60% of the time, maybe more, and just eliminates one thing that you have to worry about while you're flying your drone. You can then worry about doing your point of interest mode and making sure that your field of view is correct and that you have your subject in your field of view. But if auto isn't producing what you need it to produce, and if it's producing blown out imagery like John had shown, or excessively dark imagery where you can't really determine detail in the images, if it's creating blurry images, or if you're getting glare, that's when we might have to go in and start making manual adjustments to the settings of the camera. So I thought it was important to talk about how a camera works fundamentally. All a camera really is a little box that allows light to come into it, and that light strikes some sort of photosensitive surface. It used to be film. Now almost no one uses film. We use digital cameras. And while that technology has advanced, the fundamental mechanics behind that are the same. We can adjust three things in order to get the proper amount of light, or the amount of light that we want, into the camera and onto the film so that we ultimately have the best photograph at the end of the day. Three things we can control are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And we're going to go over those momentarily. So this is the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is a visual representation of what we can adjust in a photograph in order to correct certain environmental issues. Along the bottom, you'll notice shutter speed, and that says 1/4 second to 1/8,000th of a second. And that indicates the amount of time that the shutter is open and exposing the light of your subject to the film. On the left side, you'll see the aperture. The aperture refers to an orifice in the front of the camera or in the lens that opens and closes and allows a certain amount of light to come through, and it really meters the light. And then to the right is your ISO, and your ISO refers to the sensitivity of your film or the sensitivity of the photosensitive surface, the sensor in the instance of a digital camera. And we can adjust all these based on certain environmental conditions to give us the proper exposure and what we need. So first we're going to talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed refers to the amount of time that the camera shutter is open and exposing light to the image's sensor. The longer that it's open, the more light will be exposed to the sensor and the brighter it will become. Now, if you find that your images are overexposed or have some ghosting or motion blur, you might be running into a situation where your shutter is open for too long. You should shorten your shutter speed to reduce the amount of light that comes through into the sensor. But one thing that can happen is if you shorten your shutter speed or lengthen your shutter speed, excuse me, it can cause motion blur. So you'll see on this image down at the bottom, the longer your shutter is open, the longer an object that is moving can expose itself to the sensor and create blur. So that's something to keep in mind as well. After shutter speed, another feature or another control that we can adjust is the aperture. The aperture refers to the openness of an orifice in the camera lens. The wider that orifice is open, the more light gets in. So if you find that your images are not properly exposed, you can also adjust the aperture. The wider the aperture as stated, and in this image on the left, you'll notice that this orifice, or this is an indication of the orifice almost wide open. You'll notice that it's letting a ton of light through and this image is blown out. Here towards the center, f8, you'll notice that this is a pretty well exposed image. Even f5.6 or f11 are better than on the extremes, but you really want to aim for something here in the center, which indicates the proper exposure. You can see all the lights, you can see all the darks, and nothing really loses detail. Likewise, if you have it too far closed, you can have an underexposure situation, which is better than an overexposure situation because you can still get some detail out of it, but at the end of the day, we aim for proper exposure. The last lever that you can control when you're taking your digital photography is your ISO. Now, the ISO refers to the sensitivity of the camera sensor. We typically recommend that you keep that as low as possible, which is 100, which will reduce the amount of grain in the image. If you're in a low light situation and adjusting your shutter speed in the aperture doesn't help, you can also adjust your ISO, but be careful. The more sensitive you make your film and the higher your ISO, the more you risk having a grainy image. You can see that again along the bottom here. To the left, ISO 100, this is a nice clear view. You look in the sky, there's really, it looks like the sky. If you come over here, as they're increasing your ISO, you see this noise and this graininess in the sky, and even on your subject, and that's really not good for a high quality deliverable. So one tool that you can use if you're running into a situation where you have too much light, you can also use an ND filter. An ND filter is a neutral density filter, and it's essentially sunglasses that you can put on your drone and allows for flexibility when using certain photo and video techniques. You can use it in tandem in some of the other recommendations that we've made, such as adjusting the shutter speed. And some drones, particularly the Mavic 2 Zoom and the Mavic 1 series, don't give you the ability to adjust your aperture, so you have no other option but to use your ND filter to meter the light that's coming into the image. You can also use these in situations of glare, where you might have bright siding, a metal roof, or even a light-colored roof could create glare, and the ND filter can help with that as well. Photographing light colors, this is a common issue that people run into. And again, having a light-colored roof or light-colored siding, bright white, yellow, anything bright can also often be overexposed and create glare on bright days. There's a few techniques that we recommend to minimize this. One would be to take your photogrammetry on days that aren't super bright. Days that are overcast are great, or even partly cloudy, as long as you keep that cloud cover consistent throughout your flight. But that being said, we can't always control the environment. I mean, if you have a choice, you can, but generally speaking, if we wait for an overcast day, we might be waiting a long time. So you can also shorten your shutter speed, but the key is to adjust your shutter speed enough so that there's some detail on the roof, but not so much that the rest of the image becomes so dark that you can't use it. So you want to find that central area between proper exposure and not under and overexposure. And as stated before, you can use an ND filter to assist with that. The last point that we're going to touch on here is the histogram. So in the last slide, we were talking about finding something that wasn't too bright and wasn't too dark. And the histogram is a tool that you can use to visually represent the exposure of your image. The histogram is a feature on all DJI drones, and you can get to that in your settings, and it'll float over your screen while you're flying. And what you can do is keep an eye on the histogram while you're flying and adjusting your settings. You'll notice here that this is a representation of an image that's taken at several different exposures, and the corresponding histogram at the bottom. So over to the left here, we have a dark image, and you'll notice that the histogram is bunched up to the left. That means that it's underexposed and could be, too dark, obviously. The second one over is your normal exposure, and you'll see that that normal exposure is, a pretty uniform dispersion throughout the histogram. And then the other two on the right are overexposed. You'll notice the one all the way to the right is very overexposed. You notice it's very bright, and you lose a lot of detail. And you can see that the histogram is bunched to the right. That's indicative of an overexposed image. So focus on the histogram and try to make sure it is as uniformly distributed as possible. So we'd like to end this on just a few takeaways. Always start using your auto settings. It works the majority of the time, and you should start with that. But if you do a flight on auto and you review your imagery before you leave the job site, which you should always be doing, you should make the appropriate changes, and you should have the know-how to make the appropriate changes, and hopefully this presentation gave you that. After reviewing your images, make the adjustments if you need to, and check your deliverables again. And if you have to fly it again, do that. It's a lot better to fly a mission 2 or 3 times, or redo it when you're on site, as opposed to leaving and going back to the office and getting ready to upload everything, and then realizing that half of your imagery isn't usable, and then you have to go back out again. It's just not a good look for efficiency, and it's not a good look, to your customer. And finally, before uploading the Scanify, go through and actually remove the images that have glare or other issues that might have missed. John posted a great YouTube video on the Scanify channel recently, and it's a super useful tool for you to go through and figure out which images are useful and which ones you should remove in order to improve the quality of your model. And finally, practice. A lot of this isn't intuitive, but the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. And just keep practicing.